What might academic freedom look like in the year 2025? That's the subject of this week's Future Trends Forum conversation. Hi, my name is Brian Alexander. I'm the forum's creator and host. With me, as usual, is the very telegenic Kat Ash, and I just wanted to quickly introduce this week's program. The subject is of a great deal of importance because, as I speak, we are about a week into the second Trump administration. The United States is already reeling under the impact of a string of executive orders, new policies, a whole bunch of statements. It's a pretty heady and stressful time. With a great deal of anxiety in higher education about how we're going to do our work moving forward. So this week's forum hosts the absolutely splendid Jeremy Young from PEN America. Jeremy is a terrific expert in academic freedom and freedom of speech. As a guest, I find that he is just a fountain of knowledge, but also someone who can express that knowledge really concisely, really clearly. As usual, the forum community asks great questions, and Jeremy handles them with just wonderful concision and richness. And we even have a nice return visit from a previous guest, Professor Jennifer Ruth, who also wrote about academic freedom. So we have a nice conversation of guests. I think that this subject is one that's going to be a great deal of interest to everybody in higher education as well as to everybody adjacent to higher education. As you watch this, I hope you are all well. I hope you are all safe and sound. I know this can be a very challenging time for everybody, and I hope in our small way the Future Trends Forum can be of help. I hope all of you have thoughts and responses to this discussion. Please join us in the comments. We'd love to hear your replies and thoughts. And if you don't feel like you can share your thoughts publicly, please reach out to me directly. I'd be glad to hear from you. Hope everybody is well. Now, on with the program. All right. Well, we have the beginning of the hour, so let us begin. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Future Trends Forum. I'm delighted to see you here today, as always. We have a fantastic guest talking about an essential subject, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. For several years now, we've been looking closely at academic freedom and freedom of speech and education, and we're doing this from different angles. We've been doing it from the point of view of the right to learn. We've been doing it from the point of view of what academic freedom constitutes legally and within the processes of higher education. And now today we want to bring up a super guest who is focused like a laser on this subject. Jeremy C. Young is with PEN America, and he's been working on a project about academic freedom and academic censorship. And with any further ado, I'd like to bring him up on stage. And hopefully we've done just that. Hello, sir.
Hello, thanks for having me. Great to be here again.
Oh, my pleasure. Good to see you back. And I should say neighbor because I'm in downtown. I'm at the Marriott, so I could have just walked over to your office and done this if I only thought of it.
You know, I was there until about 15 minutes ago, so we really were very close indeed.
Oh, and we actually have a similar kind of outfit going on too.
It's true.
Jeremy, you know how we ask people to introduce themselves on the forum by asking what you're working on next. What's ahead for you for the rest of this year?
Oh my goodness! I mean, we one of the things we do at PEN America is respond to state level and federal legislation that impacts academic freedom and university autonomy in higher education. And so, with state legislative sessions kicking off this month and the federal administration kicking off right now this week, we are drinking from a fire hose. And what am I doing for the rest of this next few months? I'm just watching things come in over state legislative and federal transom and responding as best I can.
Well, I think we're going to ask you some questions about what's coming up over the transom. How do you do this work? Do you write articles? Do you make videos? Do you publish social media? Give talks? Travel? How do you make this actually work?
We do all of those things, and I should note that we have a robust team here at PEN America working on these things. Several other people, in addition to me, who make this all possible. There's no way I could do all of that myself. But yeah, we do legislative tracking and analysis in all 50 states and the federal government. We publish a major report every year. Most recent one came out in October, rounding up the state legislative sessions. We do a lot of commentary, a lot of media conversations, a lot of events like this one, and we also do a lot of coalition work. We have a group of higher ed associations that we work closely with. We have a bunch of retired college presidents who we work with to try to build relationships that can build a movement for higher ed to defend itself.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. I mean, that does sound like you need a small army to make all of that work. That's a huge amount. In the chat, by the way, you have Fan and Krista Heiser, who says that she saw your excellent presentation last year at the Council for Higher Education Accreditation.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be there with.
Friends, if you're new to the Future Trends Forum, the way it works is I'm going to ask our guest a couple of questions, and then I'm going to turn it over to you for your questions, your comments, and your thoughts. So you may already have some of those because of the topic and Jeremy's work. And as Jeremy answers my persnickety questions, you may have some more comments and questions and thoughts. So please, get ready in the chat box, get ready in the to fire questions in the Q&A box, or if you just want to be face-to-face with us. It's obvious that Jeremy is part of that underground of forum guests who don't have beards. So, if you don't have a beard, you are definitely welcome to join us. I guess, Jeremy, the first question is going to be a big one right out of the gate. At the federal level, what should colleges and universities expect about academic freedom, the freedom to learn, and our freedom of speech? What kind of challenges should we expect from the Trump administration?
Well, if I had a beard, I'd tug on it strategically here while I formulate an answer. But not having that, I'm going to have to just jump right in. I mean, we are already starting to see an onslaught of attacks, most of which so far have been rather glancing at higher education, although there was an executive order a couple of days ago that specifically mentioned teeing up a group of investigations in elite research institutions with large endowments, going after them for civil rights violations on the grounds that they have a DEI office, which is pretty extreme, if you ask me. But we really expect that the bigger attacks are coming later, and we're expecting things on a few different fronts. One is, what we're seeing already, this sort of jawboning threats, committee investigations, agency investigations, potentially frivolous lawsuits going after universities for really doing their job, for promoting diversity on campus, for for allegedly violating civil rights law when they're really just doing what they've been doing all along. These kind of threats have been emerging at the state level. We've seen a lot of them, and they're very difficult to combat because in the absence of legislation, in the absence of a hearing where people can object to a bill or a law that can be challenged in court, it's pretty hard to for a president of a university to respond directly to this kind of intimate jawboning threat that is being made. Beyond that, I think we're going to see some challenges in terms of research funding. There's already some indications that that's going to happen, that federal research grants they've already been stripped of all of their diversity focuses, but they may go further than that. They may attempt to weaponize federal research funding to say you can only receive it if your institution doesn't have a DEI office or DEI programming. Unclear whether that's constitutional or permissible under the current Higher Education Act, but we could imagine that happening for sure. I do think that there will also be a sort of weaponization of Title VI enforcement with the Office of Civil Rights, which has already, in our judgment, been over-enforcing Title VI in the ways that it has expansively interpreted anti-Semitism over the last year on campuses, but now expanding that power to going after not just allegations of anti-Semitism, but just the mere fact of having DEI programming or race-related programming of any type as some sort of violation of civil rights law under Title VI of the Higher Education Act. And the final thing that we're expecting to see, and this I think is really where the big ball game is going to be, is attacks on accreditation. So higher education accreditors, nonpartisan organizations that accredit higher education institutions, most of them have a DEI standard, which is a voluntary standard that universities sort of determine for themselves how they're going to handle diversity on their campuses. And then the accreditor will hold them to that standard that they've set for themselves over subsequent accreditation cycles.
Mm.
there is talk of banning accreditors or refusing to recognize accreditors at the federal level that have DEI standards. That I think is likely to happen. But I think the real ball game, and this is what is in Project 2025, and what I think will probably be tried, but is going to be subject to some real challenge, is attempting to weaponize the accreditors themselves, essentially saying that the governor of Florida, for instance, can serve as his own accreditor, and he can be the only accreditor recognized in the state of Florida, and he can choose to de-accredit any institutions that don't put forward a sort of conservative curriculum or that have any kind of diversity work at all. And that would, that would essentially turn accreditation on its head, because accreditation is required in order for universities to, or higher education institutions to, receive federal financial aid for their students, which 55% of all students in the country receive. So cutting off access to federal financial aid as a weapon using the process of accreditation, that's something that's going to be tried. It's unclear whether it can be accomplished without legislation or whether it's constitutional, but I think that's going to be a real fight as well.
I have so many questions in response to this. And first of all, I have to ask, how do you manage to compact so much information into just a handful of sentences? That's just elegant.
Repetition. I talk about these things all the time. I'm a former teacher. I taught for a decade before I started doing this work. So, just like you, I and many of your listeners, I have experience in this sort of thing.
Well, excellent. What did you teach?
I taught history. I was a U.S. and European history teacher. My research is in late 19th, early 20th century political communication.
Sure. Excellent. Then a more substantial question is, it sounds like a lot of these are kind of opening moves, or initial hints about opening moves, and that a lot of them have to go through different processes. So they may have to work their way through operational channels. They may face legal challenges back and forth. Is that an accurate assessment?
Yes, I think almost all of these moves will face legal challenges, and of course, with the courts themselves leaning conservative, it's unclear, which of these legal challenges will be successful. But it seems that some of there are a couple of grounds for challenge with these policies. One, of course, is racial discrimination under the 14th Amendment, but there's also for some of these restrictions there are free speech considerations under the First Amendment, and there's also, and what we've seen with the state level legislation, the most successful challenges have been focused on the question of vagueness, which is also unconstitutional. A law that is so vague that you can't possibly avoid running afoul of it under someone's interpretation. So we've seen a lot of that with these state level bills. They don't define their terms. They don't explain what DEI means. If they try to explain it, it's unclear or overly broad. And we're seeing some of that in the executive orders as well at the federal level. So I think those could be challenges. And then finally, one additional one at the federal level, which is the question of whether some of these administrative acts can be undertaken under the framework of the Higher Education Act, or whether the administration would have to pass new legislation to do something like change the accreditation structure, which would, of course, require a vote of Congress and be subject to a filibuster.
We haven't had a renewal of the Higher Education Act, have we?
No, it's very hard to get Congress to agree on new provisions to the Higher Education Act. There were amendments passed in the 90s. That's the most recent substantive change, and there's a reason for that. It's very hard to do, and particularly with very narrow Republican majorities in the House in particular, and then the Senate filibuster could make this challenging. So I would expect to see some of these things make it into a reconciliation package, but there's a limited number of things that can be put into a reconciliation package. They could be excluded as not germane to the budget. There's a whole lot of hurdles they would have to overcome if they want to try to pass something legislatively.
That's interesting. I have more questions, but I want to give some floor over to everybody else who has questions. We have one from our dear friend, Professor Ed Webb at Dickinson College, and he has a specific question. I have a follow-up to this as well. Which is, what are the speech censorship implications of Harvard's adoption of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism? Are other institutions, elite or otherwise, likely to follow suit?
So yes, we have significant concern about this. Just as a brief explanation, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism gives a very general, short definition, which is pretty unobjectionable, and then it lists a series of examples, 12, 15 examples of things that could be considered part of anti-Semitism, or statements that include these. It's sort of a red flag that there might be anti-Semitism in the statement. And several of those examples include simply the criticism of Israel in particular ways. Now, in and of itself, this is not untrue. Sometimes when people criticize Israel, they're also anti-Semitic. That's a true statement. But the author of that definition, Kenneth Stern, has stated very clearly that it is not intended to be a legal definition, that banning speech on the grounds not only of the general definition but of the examples is unconstitutional. And what we are seeing is, this came actually from a Goldwater Institute model bill that was released in 2016, and now it's appearing all over the place. The idea that this definition, that the examples should be treated not as potential indicators of anti-Semitism, but as absolute proof of anti-Semitism. So any criticism of Israel of any kind is proof of anti-Semitism. That's the concern. And what the Office of Civil Rights has been doing, and what Harvard agreed to in adopting this definition, is essentially that. They agreed to, Harvard's adoption is a little bit unclear. They say they will use the examples in the ways that they are intended to be used. It's not clear, but it really raises the possibility that that any criticism of Israel could be viewed as anti-Semitic on the Harvard campus, and that Harvard is doing this in order to get out from under OCR's thumb, under an OCR investigation. That's deeply concerning. We don't want universities to clamp down on constitutionally protected speech. To be clear, anti-Semitic speech, if part of a sustained campaign of harassment, not constitutionally protected. Individual utterances are, and certainly criticism of Israel is constitutionally protected. We don't want them to feel that they cannot allow that speech because the government is telling them that they can't, and nor do we want them to ban that speech on their own.
Well, I'm curious if we can extrapolate from that a little bit further. And by the way, thank you very much for the clear backgrounder on the IHRA. I share a link to it in the chat. Do you, Harvard is just one of 4,000 or so colleges and universities in the U.S., but they have an outsized influence for any number of reasons. Do you think it's likely that we'll see other colleges and universities follow suit?
I think so. And I mean, we've seen negative responses to these OCR investigations. Again, these all took place under the Biden administration. We expect this to be even more significant use of OCR in the Trump administration. But another example was the case of Maura Finkelstein at Muhlenberg College, who basically said two things that she and the administration and the government all agreed were anti-Semitic. And then there were 6 additional charges against her based on constitutionally protected political speech that she made on X, which the university threw out and said were not part of a pattern of harassment. OCR then stepped in and said, you have to consider those other 6 cases as part of the pattern. And because it's now 8 cases instead of 2, now it's pervasive harassment that is repeated over and over again. Again, it's really troubling to see the government, whether Democrat or Republican, using this kind of expansive definition of harassment or of anti-Semitism to apply to faculty on college campuses.
Oh, it is indeed. This is, first of all, thank you very much for that excellent answer, Jeremy, and thank you, Ed, for the very, very important question. We have a follow-up on this, and this is from a dear friend in Ohio who couldn't make it here today, the excellent Professor Stephen Volk. And I'm just going to read this out to you because I can't show it on the screen. I'm interested in what has become known as the Palestine exception, i.e. that free speech, academic freedom is allowed, except in areas where you are likely to be called out, often unfairly, sometimes fairly, as anti-Semitic by Republicans in the House and red state legislators. Any thoughts on how to negotiate this?
It's a very complicated issue. And the reality is, look, I want to be clear here at the outset. There are plenty of anti-Semitic things that have been said on campuses during the protests. There were plenty of anti-Semitic things being said on campuses before the protests. In fact, some of the data we have indicates that anti-Semitism on campus was on the rise before October 7th. In fact, at the beginning of 2023, it began to increase. So this is a real problem, and I don't want to dismiss how real it is. But there is a real need, even if it's difficult, even if it's a challenging call, it's challenging for us too at Penn. There's a real need to separate out what is constitutionally protected political speech or constitutionally protected utterances that may be anti-Semitic, but that are constitutionally protected, no matter how abhorrent, from things that are legally actionable, from harassment, from something that is severe and pervasive and targeted, which is the legal definition of harassment. Just because something is said is abhorrent doesn't mean that it can be directly censored. And there is a sense, I think, that around this issue, there is, and frankly, not just things that are abhorrent, things that are viable political speech, simply support for Palestine, support for Gaza, opposition to the government of Israel, that does get brought up in these dragnets. I think it's a real problem. I think both of these things are a real problem.
Well, I appreciate the complexity and nuance of your response. And Stephen, as always, I'm really grateful to you for this question. Friends, if you're new to the forum, these are examples of chat questions and Q&A questions. And we have another Q&A question right now. And this is from Lizette Fernandez. Let me put this up on the screen. Two-part question. How will the Florida accreditation affect public universities financially? And how much of their funding do they receive from the federal government?
So first of all, I want to stress that I consider it relatively unlikely that degree of change in accreditation, that individual states would be able to serve as their own accreditors, will come to pass, at least anytime soon. It does seem that kind of a change would only be possible through a change to the rulemaking structure in the Department of Education, which is mandated by the Higher Education Act. I think that would likely require new legislation. I've heard this actually from people who want to stand up new accreditors that I disagree with, frankly, who say it's impossible under the current situation, the current system, no matter who's president or who's the Secretary of Education. But if this were to take place, it would be devastating for any university that did not comply with the restrictions. 55% of all students nationwide receive some form of federal student aid. That percentage does not differ greatly between public and private institutions, between blue states and red states. It's pretty consistent across the board. And historically, universities that have lost accreditation from the existing accreditors, about 50% of them have closed their doors. And so, it is a very serious threat to lose, to have accreditation and the process of being recognized for federal financial aid be essentially captured by political actors rather than run by the kind of nonpartisan, academic-focused organizations that currently run it.
Well, this is interesting, and that's definitely a good caution, especially in the bipartisan sense. Lizette, I hope this answers your really good question, and if you'd like to follow up, please do so, either in the Q&A or with a question. Friends, the floor is yours. We're covering a lot of topics in a hurry, and I want to make sure everyone gets a chance to ask their questions, and also to feel comfortable asking questions. This is a complicated subject that can often be emotionally fraught, as well as just politically very challenging. In the chat, Ed Webb goes on to say, I have significant concerns as someone who teaches on Israel and its neighbors. That's because the ADL and others leaning into the IHRA definition and somewhere get in the way of fighting the actual anti-Semitism that I agree is a very real danger. Thank you.
I think that's a great comment, by the way, and I wholeheartedly agree with it. I think that not the definition itself, which as a sort of academic scholarly exercise to try to understand how anti-Semitism functions, which is insidious and multifaceted, I think is really smart. But the use of that definition as law or as policy or as a definition of what speech can be silenced, I think is counterproductive to the fight against anti-Semitism. I mean, what we're seeing is instances where there are, and I hope this is not, that this is not the main focus. There are too many instances where people who claim to be trying to fight anti-Semitism, to stop anti-Semitism on campus, are instead exploiting anti-Semitism to pursue their own goals. We saw that very clearly, I think, in the congressional hearings last year with the presidents, where Representative Virginia Fox said in her opening remarks that DEI was the cause of anti-Semitism and that therefore DEI needed to be the focus of the hearings. I think that's a misunderstanding of how of how these things are connected, and really just an effort to sort of pivot back to things that she wants to talk about, rather than the very real threat of anti-Semitism that is in fact on our campuses and in our society.
Understood. Thank you for that. And I'm really glad that we can have this dialogue here. Uh, we have another question, which comes at this from a different angle, and this is from our great friend in Hawaii, Krista Heiser. And in the chat, she asks, can you talk about self-censorship and how we can support faculty?
So this is a really important point because the impact of these sweeping restrictions, of these threats that are coming out of government entities, is to make everyone very afraid, and that includes administrators who are afraid of losing funding, losing their
Mhm.
jobs, losing the ability to support their students and their faculty and their staff. But also, it really does move down to faculty. Faculty in states where these laws have been enforced, where this rhetoric has been present, have been terrified for years. They have engaged in self censorship. There are, and now that it's becoming a federal threat, I think we're going to see this all over the country. And I would urge people to really think about what your context is, what your situation is, how vulnerable you are to these kind of threats or not vulnerable. Some people are in very vulnerable positions, but there are faculty who have the ability to continue doing their work, and I think should continue doing their work as much as possible, unchanged by these attacks. Unless something actually happens, unless somebody actually starts, bringing bans or restrictions to a campus, unless those restrictions are mandated in law.
Mhm.
I think that is the challenge. The challenge with censorship is not to do the censors' work for them, because that chilling effect is real, and it does convince people. I think for the best of reasons, that they have to protect themselves, they have to protect their classrooms, they have to protect their institutions by not saying anything at all. And that is why censorship is so dangerous. It's why this kind of vague language is unconstitutional, and it's something that we just have to fight. We're not encouraging anyone to break the law. Even if the law is
Mhm.
unconstitutional, you can challenge it in court without breaking it. There's no need for that. But we are encouraging people to stand their ground, do their work, unless they are actually stopped from doing something by an administrator, by some sort of law that is telling them that they can't do a particular thing.
Mm. Well, thank you for that call. I'm glad to see Penn picking that up. Uh, Everybody, I have a couple of questions myself to put to Jeremy, but please, again, this is your space, this is your environment where you can ask your questions, and you can see that we've already covered a wide range of topics under this header, so you should feel free to ask. And before I can even finish saying that sentence, somebody had a question, which I love, and this comes from Elaine, who asked, "Are you seeing academic libraries harmed due to their collections, i.e., book bans, or privacy concerns? And does this come from the federal government, folks in the campus community, or from citizens in general?"
We keep waiting for the shoe to drop with academic libraries, and I'm sure it will at some point. We have not seen a lot of threats to those libraries thus far. I think largely because they are, the kind of, there's of course overwhelming attacks on school libraries at the K-12 level, but I think the fact that academic libraries are serving adults makes them a little bit of insulated from this. There's not a lot of good constitutional ways to attack uh, an academic library, and while we're certainly seeing that a lot of these attacks don't care whether they're constitutional and are
Mm,
happy to just sort of scare people. We just haven't seen very much, but I know that a lot of people working in academic libraries, a lot of people representing academic libraries are on high alert for this, and we are on high alert for it as well.
mm. And we've seen this in public libraries as well as K through 12 libraries. Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Elaine, thank you very much. It's always good to have libraries represented and library concerns. And of course, libraries have historically done heroic work in giving people access to information and supporting free expression. Uh, I have a couple of technical or technological questions, rather. And first is I'm wondering if you could speak a bit to some of the impacts of changing social media on academic free speech. Some of the cases we've been talking about have concerned expressions taking place in various forms of social media. But of course, social media is changing in many ways. We have the new takeoff of Blue Sky, we have the sudden death, sudden resurrection of TikTok. We have questions of ownership, of content management on platforms like Facebook. I'm wondering, what does this mean for higher education? Should we expect to see more of this? That someone will say something on Twitter or Blue Sky or LinkedIn that will get them in trouble, or do you see any other changes in it?
Well, what's distinct about higher education. What isn't distinct about higher education? I'll start there. Is faculty members, staff members saying something on social media and having professional consequences for that? Because that is happening in every field and has been for over a decade. People use social media in ways that are impolitic, that are incautious. Feel like they're talking to their friends, but they're actually talking to the whole world and their boss, and it gets seen and they get in trouble. What is distinct about higher education is that under academic freedom, faculty are supposed to have the right to extramural utterances. They are supposed to be able to opine on matter as private citizens on matters of public concern, including on social media, without facing professional consequences. Now, of course, if you're if you're saying mean things about your students on social media and you name them, that's bad, and that can lead to very serious consequences very quickly. Commentary about the university is more of a gray area, but people commenting on public events, people commenting on global conflicts or elections, these are supposed to be protected for faculty in a way that they aren't protected for others, and that's in part because of faculty members' role as arbiters of knowledge, as people who need to be able to express and teach beliefs in the classroom and follow research topics related to viewpoints that may be unpopular or maybe even be offensive. And so there is more leeway, more latitude given to faculty. And social media has really tested that portion of academic freedom, because of course you say something and it's written right there and people can see it. This has been an issue since at least the Stephen Salaita case at the University of Illinois in 2015. So for at least a decade now, the faculty members have been targeted for their online speech on matters of public concern. I think that is part of what has made it such a focal point in discussions of academic freedom, is the way that social media sort of broadcasts these views to all sorts of audiences, makes them easily searchable, easily findable.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think this is something we need to. Do you have any advice at Penn for academics using social media? Should any practices we should adopt, or any cautions or recommendations?
Yes, we have a campus free speech guide, which I'll drop a link in the chat in just a minute, which gives sort of general advice on campus speech issues and principles around various issues. I mean, our general advice on social media use is to, I think it really aligns with the AAUP's guidance on this. But the AAUP is a little known section of the AAUP statement on academic freedom and tenure indicates that faculty should, they are public figures. They are figures with a certain amount of prestige, with responsibility to represent their institutions and their fields, and that they should speak with caution and with discretion when they comment on things. But the key is that is a voluntary recommendation. It's not something that should be imposed on them by the universities, by the government. And one person's definition of speaking with caution and with circumspection is very different from another. Some people will argue that a particular conflict or a particular moment or election is so world historical that it changes everything and that it needs to be remarked on in certain ways. That's their right under definitions of academic freedom. So we encourage people to use social media responsibly, just as we would in any other profession. But we do think that it is protected speech when they do so in a way that others may not see as responsible.
Well, thank you for that. I wish quite a few people had that advice quite some time ago. We have a related question, and this comes from our dear friend in Connecticut, Roxanne, who asks about the technology that gets even more attention than social media. Will we see AI hinder or maybe even help bring awareness to any type of censorship, considering that AI is human information put into the AI models?
Oh, it's a difficult question. I'm not an expert on AI. I am deeply concerned about AI as a private citizen. Penn doesn't really have a lot of positions on it, but I'll tell you what I think. I mean, I think that that AI ultimately AI is a way of saying things that are sort of mimicking what humans say, right? No matter how sophisticated it is, no matter how it seems to be talking to you, it is still mimicking what it reads in a large language, a large body of language, a large corpus of language. And so ultimately AI, I think, is reflecting what we as living humans are saying and doing to each other. So I can imagine a situation, for instance, where AI could, somebody could use AI to say something for them, and then that is offensive speech, and it becomes targeted. I could imagine that happening. I certainly think this is a big challenge for instructors right now, with students using AI and ChatGPT in all kinds of horrifying ways. But I think that ultimately, we're going to face the same challenges with AI that we face with every other technology, because ultimately it's a reflection of us in the same way as those other technologies are.
Do you think? Well, first of all, thank you for that really concise answer, and thank you, Roxanne, for this question. Uh, I mean, do you think that we will see governments, not just the U.S. federal government and state governments, but also other national governments, perhaps European Union, faced with the flood of AI-generated content, might they adopt rules and regulations to control that, which ends up controlling free speech?
I think that's a risk. I think that we're having a discussion of AI, just like we are of any other form of technology, that is really, one side is arguing for sort of techno supremacy, where whatever the platform creators want to manipulate their algorithms, that should be totally unregulated, and they can do whatever they want. And the other side is saying, well, maybe we should censor electronic speech because it's so scary. And I don't think either of those is the right answer. I mean, our goal is to protect and promote the speech and the experience of the individual, and that has to be done through, I think, careful regulation, through voluntary regulation, potentially through government restrictions, but not through outright bans, not through censorship, of individual types of speech.
That's a nice answer. That's a very good answer. In the chat, our friend in Texas, Tom Haim, says we need to recognize artificial speech as artificial. Anything else is silly.
Totally agree. Totally agree with that.
Well, thinking about this, I'd like to, if I could, bring us back to a previous Future Transform session. And for those who didn't see it, we had Michael Berbet and Jennifer Ruth on talking about a recent book they wrote about academic freedom. So it wasn't a book about freedom of speech per se. It was specifically very narrowly about academic freedom.
It's not free speech, so it's definitely not a book about free speech. Yes.
And their model, I'm going to try and summarize it, and I might do this crudely, but their model was that academic freedom should be enforced and policed by departments and academic units. So there shouldn't be something that a president weighs in on, or somebody external to academia, such as a state governor or something. But there should be, if you're a historian, for example, it should be the history department who determines if your speech counts. If you're a librarian, it should be your library who determines this. I mean, again, that's not saying there's no such thing as free speech. It's a specific count of that, and I'm wondering, looking at that definition, thinking about that, is that something which we can lean on in the next year as some state governments and the federal government get excited and act out about academic speech?
So I agree in part and disagree in part with their model. I think that they are, that they may give faculty a little too much credit in their ability to, on the one hand, root out people who are engaging in things that really are nefarious under the guise of academic freedom, and on the other hand, not impose their own sort of parochial disciplinary, biases on those decisions. I worry a little bit about the issue, the Kuhnian definition of paradigm shift, and
Mhm.
and what if people from the old paradigm are controlling the tenure committee, and they're the ones deciding. This is already a problem in academia, and I think that it's not a perfect solution. But I do think that it's vitally important that universities as a sector, as a community, are able to make decisions, make decisions about, how their governance works. I think and particularly I would emphasize on ideological questions. I think that there is certainly room for governments to weigh in on questions of access and completion, for students to weigh in on, campus safety, the way budgets are spent, the way community relations work. But I think when you're talking about, what ideas can be present on a campus, that has to be up to the campus. And I would extend that beyond the question of academic freedom, uh, which applies specifically to faculty and arguably to students, but also to the question of things like whether a DEI office can exist on a campus. I think that's a campus's decision. This is the question of university autonomy, and it's something I talk about a lot these days because it's not very well understood in the United States. Americans, tend to think of academic freedom as inhering in the individual faculty member, whereas Europeans tend to think of university autonomy as inhering in the institution itself. That the institution needs to be protected from political interference by government officials. And I think we need both of those things. We have to understand that academic freedom of faculty is only possible insofar as their administration is not being pressured by the governor or the legislature to shut down certain ideas. And whether that pressure takes place in the creation of offices or the way curriculum is shaped is another thing we see sometimes now, where people are arguing that some conservatives are arguing that curriculum is not covered under academic freedom because it's not what a faculty member says in class. It's not speech, and so therefore, they can ban general education courses. They can restrict, all sorts of majors and minors. Just make sure that faculty member who teaches critical race theory is never hired. Then you don't have to restrict what they say in the classroom.
Wow.
I think that's really dangerous, and I think that's a shared governance attack, is what it is. And I think all of these things fall under the umbrella of ideological autonomy of the university, ideological autonomy of the sector. I think that's vitally important.
It makes me think about how many nations have universities where autonomous is in the title. The Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM, or Barcelona, and so on.
Right.
Along these lines, I evoked Professor Ruth, and she appeared. Let me bring her up on stage. I think. Let me see. Professor Ruth, I'm not sure. It looks like your audio and video are off. Let's see if we can work on that.
She's a shadow.
She's a shadow of her former self.
Not sure she's not.
Well, while we're working on that, we have another question that's come up from our friend and one of our friends in Scotland. We have a whole bunch of Future Transformed fans in Scotland, and this is Vigene Demeke, who asks, "What are your thoughts on personal or institutional self-censorship as a result of funding pressures?"
So this is a really big question when it comes to, at the moment, we're seeing this as a question related to federal research funds, which, as I said, I think are going to be weaponized in this administration against certain research topics. But it has already been a concern because of donors to an institution, funders for a particular project, right? It's hard to get this kind of funding and not have it have some kind of impact on your work. Now, I am a qualified defender of some of this funding, so including of donors. The goal is there is a right and a wrong way to do this kind of funding. The right way is you figure out what you want to do, you figure out what you want to study, and then you find people to fund it who support what you're doing. And if you do that, and they support not only the goals you're trying to achieve, but also the independence of inquiry, so that if you find something, if you discover something that is not what you expected and that leads you in a different direction, you can continue to do that. I think that can work out fine. The problem occurs when people want the money so badly that they're willing to go to funders, whether individual donors, foundations, or whatever, who place impermissible restrictions on that money. The reality is that our higher education institutions have been systematically defunded at the state level. They need external funding if they are to survive, and if they are to employ faculty and train students at the level that they do. I think the process of getting money for universities through donors, through foundations, is a solid one. It is ultimately to the benefit of everyone there, but it has to be done with an understanding that at some level you're going to say no to money that is going to take you in a direction that doesn't support the aims of your project or doesn't support the aims of the institution.
That's a very tricky one, especially when you have a large institution that's very heterogeneous. You might bring in money for one project, but that's one that is opposed by somebody else on campus.
But it really depends on the strength of the donor in understanding what the value of the institution is. And there also, I think university leaders have a role to play in helping donors understand what a university is, how it works. A good donor should be able to see, okay, a faculty member is writing an op-ed criticizing the donor for something that they've done, or doing a research project into the donor's environmental impact, right, say. And the donor should see that as not as a threat, but they should view that as a validation that what they're supporting, the university is functioning as desired. Not every donor is going to see it that way. I think some donors naturally come with that understanding. Others can be made to see it that way, but many can't. And that, I think, is where universities have to be serious about drawing the line. If a donor is going to feel threatened because in the normal operation of the university, faculty or students are critical of them, that's not the right donor for that institution. And I think we have to be willing to say that while also recognizing that we do need donor funding for universities if they're going to survive at their current level.
Yeah, I mean, we're not going to suddenly remove private funding from higher education anytime soon. That's a fantastic question, Beginning, and thank you again for that. We have another question, and this is another typically excellent question from Tom Ames in the Houston, Texas area. He has asked, what does this week's Supreme Court decision on TikTok say about the current state of free speech in the U.S.? Does this have any bearing on the higher education debate over free speech?
Well, we signed an amicus brief saying that the Supreme Court should overturn the TikTok ban, and all 9 of the justices disagreed with us. So I'll let you draw your own conclusions about what that says. All 9, they filed a unanimous opinion, and they all agreed that it was permissible to shut down TikTok. Now, of course, that's not actually going to happen. So we kind of got the worst of both worlds, right? TikTok is going to continue doing all of the bad things that they're doing, and then we also got a Supreme Court decision saying that it's permissible for the government to shut down, social media mediums that it disagrees with. It's very concerning because obviously there are things about TikTok that make it concerning. It is it has connections to the government of China and so forth. But it is what the court has said is that we are. It's all right for the government to shut down a social media company, to shut down an entire medium of communication and expression if it disagrees with really for any reason. If it disagrees with the owners, if it disagrees with the moderation scheme or anything, how is that going to be used by our current administration and future administrations that may disagree with something that's happening on a social media platform that isn't politically friendly to them? I mean, they have just opened Pandora's box here. We're concerned about it. We're concerned about a lot of these things. In some ways, this is the natural state of a free expression organization, is to be perpetually concerned about the world, because there are a lot of powerful interests that are arranged against free expression, and those can include private interests, global interests, and also the government at times. And our job is to try to preserve it in all of these different venues.
You and the ACLU, I mean, you get to be guardians for this.
They're a little bigger than us, and they do a little more. They have a little bigger footprint when it comes to guardianship. But yes, it looks like there's a question here. Jennifer Ruth is trying to ask a question here.
I'm bringing her up right now.
Okay, great. Oh yeah, we got you. You're live.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry that I was struggling with the technology, and in fact, I missed a lot of what you said, Jeremy, about boards and donors, which I would really wish I had heard when I was trying to figure out the technology. I guess I should.
Welcome.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for mentioning, both of you, for mentioning it's not free speech. I'm a big fan of Jeremy and his work at Penn.
And it's mutual. And we're going to disagree about everything we're about to say, probably. But maybe nothing. But
I think we agree more than we disagree, don't you?
I think you're right. Yeah, I
but
I love talking to you. Anyway.
I think that you're distinguishing between actually, I want to ask about pro-Palestinian speech, really. And I apologize if I missed. It looks like maybe. Yeah, Brian, you brought up the International Holocaust Remembrance definition. Maybe this has already come up, and I apologize.
We talked about the Palestine exception earlier in the show.
Yeah.
Okay, shoot. Well, I won't make you repeat that. But so I'll just say something about university autonomy versus faculty autonomy, and how Brian did a great synopsis of the book. And then I would just add the nuance that what we're looking at is the collective, the department when you think about tenure decisions, we went off the tenure. We've gone so over into the contingency world, which does not have due process for academic freedom. It also doesn't have the kind of peer review processes built into it in most cases, where you would scholars in the same field would evaluate the work and have a collective academic freedom that's also a kind of vetted academic freedom, which is precisely very different from free speech, a la Robert Post's kind of distinctions. But then university autonomy, administrators will sometimes invoke that to say that they are the voice of the university autonomy and authority. So it's this different peer, professional, and professions. So departments sort of as a proxy, but disciplines too. So for example, if someone is being a troll in order to capitalize on this particular moment in our social media space and our political space, and they are misrepresenting scholarly work, or they're not doing scholarly research, but they're just trying to catch a wave with a certain kind of ideological bent, it would be the people in the discipline, hopefully across a range of different kinds of work in the discipline, to weigh in on whether that's reputable or not, whether that deserves academic freedom or doesn't. So, for example, someone who is saying things that 99.9% of their disciplinary peers would say, that's hocus. The collective academic freedom should validate that.
Yeah. So I mean, I think we disagree only a little bit on this. I think our perspective would be that in your book you essentially argue that there are maybe 3 or 4 cases that are so far beyond the pale, where they're arguing things that are so far removed that it should sort of sit outside of the definition of academic freedom. And I think our argument would be, well, if there's only 3 or 4 cases in a country of hundreds of thousands of faculty, then maybe the system is working, and maybe maybe it's all right to let a couple of those cases do what they're doing. But what I would say about university autonomy, I think it's a very delicate situation, because you're absolutely right. Administrators use this term. They say, oh, we have to be, we govern the university. And the short answer for me on that is that I broadly agree with the AAUP statement on government, although I would add an extra piece to it, which is that there is faculty have primary responsibility over matters that involve teaching and learning. They have primary responsibility over the curriculum, primary responsibility over tenure, hiring, and firing of other faculty, and they should have at least an advisory role, if not more, in every other aspect of the university. But then the one piece that I think the statement on government leaves out, that I would love to see a sort of additional statement added, is that when it comes to ideas on a college campus, the actual government should have no role. I think the government does have a role on campus in other aspects of campus life. They have a role in terms of community relations. They have a role in terms of access and completion for students. But when it comes to what ideas are allowed on a college campus, I think everyone should agree, who is involved in higher education, that the government does not have a say on that.
That would mean, would that mean that the courts have no say? Because I think a very interesting case for exactly the things that we're talking about, though, is Amy Wax, who's Pennsylvania decided to sanction her, to pull her out of certain things, and she's now suing. And in this political climate, the university autonomy and the due process that they went through with the faculty panel, through faculty senate, all the things that they did, all the steps that they took over the course of a year and a half, I think, could instantly get invalidated by the courts.
Yeah, I think that is, I think that's concerning. But our primary concern is when I talk about university autonomy is the imposition of ideological political restrictions on a campus. So when Chris Rufo says we're not going to have gender studies on a campus anymore because that's not what the voters want, I think that's the kind of thing that we just have to oppose categorically. It doesn't matter what the voters want. The voters want a university. And if you want a university, then you accept that a university is governed by faculty, at least as far as the curriculum, and that it has to be that way, or you're just not going to have the kind of free exchange of ideas that you need to have at a university.
I think rhetorically that's great. I think in practice it's a little more complicated.
Well, we'll certainly see. I notice Brian, that there's a comment that we should shut down all online platforms hosted by
That's
people
very
with
funny.
beards. And I think I agree with that, which means I wouldn't be allowed to be here. So, also don't use Red Note. Talking about this in the chat, just don't do it. It's not whatever is the legality of Red Note. It's not a good idea.
So just if everyone has been keeping up with that, with the impending demise of TikTok, a bunch of TikTok users went over to this Red Note application. Red Note is the nickname. I can't pronounce the full Chinese one, but it's basically the little red book. It is another Chinese application that allows you to do some of the things you do in TikTok, and it apparently is even much more surveyed by the Chinese government. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you so much for
Great
bringing
to see
it
you,
up.
Jennifer.
You too,
Such a
Jeremy.
pleasure.
I have one last question to put to you, and this is a tricky one because so much is in flux right now. But I'm wondering what advice you would give to all of us interested in academic freedom and freedom of speech. What advice you'd give to us for the next couple of years, besides obviously following you and your work, and obviously joining PEN America. And what else? What advice can you give us?
I think that these conversations are vitally important, and I think we need to have these conversations loudly and publicly, and with people who aren't in higher education. I think it's important for us to make clear to the rest of the world why it is important for universities to exist, why academic freedom is a prerequisite for a university to function as a university, and why it is desperately important that we preserve this against an administration that increasingly seems hostile to higher education, and really in a national climate that seems increasingly hostile to higher education. Higher education is not making, sorry, I'm getting a little heated here. Higher education is not making the case for itself, for why it should exist, for why it should continue. And that case, we all know what the answer is. The higher education is about the shaping of minds. It's about the opening of minds. It's about the transmittal and dissemination of knowledge and discovery of knowledge. And it's a place where people can come together and have the important conversations, the important debates, and make sure that those debates are free and fair and open. And that is a vital space in a democracy. It's something we need to preserve and indeed grow and expand. And we need to make that case to the public.
Well said. Okay, well, we can start doing that. Here at the forum, our sessions are open to anybody. And we put all of our results on YouTube, like this very recording will be. In closing, Jeremy, let me just quote from one of the chatters. Catherine James says, "May I say that Jeremy C. Young is one of the very best speakers you've ever brought to us. He is so highly knowledgeable. He answers questions in detailed and comprehensible fashion. He is clear. He's engaging and more. Thank you so much." And I second what she said. Thank you so much, Jeremy. What is the best way to keep up with you and your work with your colleagues?
I would say watch. I'm on Twitter. I'm on, or what used to be Twitter. I'm on Blue Sky, more actively now. LinkedIn. Follow our page at pen.org. We have a lot of commentary and press releases that are coming out, and yeah, happy to keep up with all of you, and great to see you all.
Well, thank you so much. Please, Jeremy, take care of yourself. Stay warm today, and keep up the great work. We'll bring you back.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Take care, Jeremy. Now, don't leave everybody else. Just want to second Jeremy's note about the questions, which are terrific. And let me just wrap things up with a few different comments. First of all, if you'd like to keep talking about this, all the different topics we talked about, everything from the different technological aspects to the Palestine exception to institutional autonomy, we can keep this conversation going across all the social media platforms that we just described. If you'd like to look into our previous sessions, including ones with some of the folks here, you can just go back to our archive at tinyurl.com/FTFarchive. If you'd like to look ahead to our sessions, we cover a wide range of topics. And coming up, we have climate justice, World Futures Day, teaching and learning centers, high school graduates, AI, and reforming grading. Just go to the Future Trends Forum website at forum.futureofeducation.us. Thank you all again so much for participating with this conversation. This is a hard one. It's a challenging topic, and it's a vital one for higher education. Thank you all for your support, your patience, your thinking, and your good humor. I hope everybody stays safe and warm and dry, and we'll see you next time online. Take care. Bye-bye.